Okay, our next speaker is Markus Gabriel, who doesn't need a long introduction in Bonn. He's been professor for epistemology, modern and contemporary philosophy here in Bonn since 2009. He is the author of close to a dozen books, of which I will only mention the most well-known one, Warum es die Welt nicht gibt. His current research is mainly concerned with questions of ontology and epistemology, which he usually links with a perspective that leads him back to classical German philosophy. So I think also in this talk today, Friedrich Schlegel's Chinese room argument.
Yeah, I thought I would speak about Friedrich Schlegel's Chinese room argument on unintelligibility until I figured out that he really doesn't have a good argument there. So now, so it's not really worth trying to spell this aspect out. Now my paper is called Meta-metaphysical Darkness, Schlegel and Schelling on Theory Building. So it's still dark, but slightly more intelligible, I think, or I hope. Despite the ever-increasing rise of interest in German idealism among contemporary philosophers, philosophical romanticism still suffers from a bad reputation. There are many reasons for the often quite general dismissal of romanticism as a serious philosophical option. Some of these reasons are, of course, very good. However, a central cornerstone of the standard rejection of romanticism as a source for contemporary philosophy is that the very texts of philosophers like Friedrich Schlegel and Schelling allegedly are unclear, unintelligible, or, at the very least, over-ambitiously original and creative. Such a general dismissal often naturally leads to ignoring the actual texts, given that one doesn't even expect to find any clearly articulated and relevant arguments there in the first place. This is roughly Brandom on philosophical romanticism. Yet this widespread attitude comes with a very high price, as it makes it impossible to understand the history of post-Kantian hermeneutics. Gadamer, Habermas, Nancy, Lacoue-Labarthe, Manfred Frank, Wolfram Hochgräber, and many others have pointed out that romanticism is crucial for the development of a theory of understanding of philosophical utterances in general, a theory whose utter absence from the contemporary philosophical debate, in my view, leads to serious confusions in the field of the various meta-disciplines, such as meta-epistemology, meta-metaphysics, and meta-ontology, just to name those I happen to be interested in. A particular source of confusion for contemporary philosophy lies in what I would like to call the translation problem, which really is a set of problems departing from a simple observation. If we try to achieve more clarity about a particular philosophical issue by translating sentences from so-called ordinary language into a local dialect of symbolic logic, we first and foremost need to have understood the meaning of the sentences to be translated. How else could we ever hope to translate them into a more precise vernacular? Yet, if it turns out that there are various translations such that we conclude that the original sentence is profoundly confused, remember the paradigm of Russell on the current King of France is bald, how could we have understood the original sentence in the first place? If there is a number n of clarifying translations, as I would like to call them, and if the original sentence was therefore not yet tied to any specific meaning, how could we even have been under the false impression that we so much as understood it? The problem is quite general. Many people seem to have no problem understanding the meaning of there is an external world, there are numbers, there is free will, there is linguistic meaning, Faust fell in love with Gretchen, some objects move, there are tables, I know that God does not exist, etc. But for any of these sentences, philosophers have raised problems that ultimately only come to light once we present our audience, including ourselves, with clarifying translations. The question then arises whether the clarifying translations are clarifying at all, or whether they might be actually responsible for the real confusion. The translation problem hangs together with a second problem, the problem of the unclarity of the ideal of clarity. Almost every philosopher would agree that clarity is a high virtue. If you deny that, then you might simply lose your reputation and never be invited again. However, if you push a number of different philosophers on the issue what this virtue actually consists in, You will soon discover that there is a plurality of mostly tacit, mutually exclusive, and often profoundly problematic assumptions out there condensed into the illusion of a single shared ideal of clarity. In his log lectures, Between Saying and Doing, Brandom draws a distinction between a hermeneutic and an algebraic sort of understanding. The wording is not very good, you know, what's a hermeneutic sort of understanding. But anyway, so that's the contrast. Brandom grants that the broadly algebraic understanding, here's a long quote, don't worry, this will lead me to Schlegel at some point. So a broadly algebraic understanding has distinctive virtues which adherents of the project of analysis are right to esteem and treasure. The slogan of the analytic project is faith, hope, and clarity, and the greatest of these is clarity. The clarity in question is specifically conceptual clarity. It would seem to have two dimensions: definiteness and perspicuity. From a pragmatic point of view, the significance of a speech act is definite insofar as its normative significance is settled. From the point of view of semantic inferentialism, this means that concepts are definite insofar as the circumstances and consequence of application are settled, when one is committed and entitled to apply them, and what such application commits and entitles one to. Perspicuity is then epistemic or, that's interesting, epistemic or psychological ease of access to those circumstances and consequences of application. On this line, blah, 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 inferentialism. You know the story. So in other work of his, Brandom spells this out in terms of a theory of clarity premised on the idea that philosophy is a specific activity of making commitments explicit that one implicitly draws on when inferentially moving through a conceptual space. This broadly Hegelian model is well known, and it aims at providing a solution to the translation problem and to the problem of unclarity of the very ideal of clarity. Of course, there are other competing theories of clarity also designed to solve or overcome the translation problem in very different ways. Timothy Williamson, for instance, follows in the footsteps of the Phrygian ideal of clarity. He argues that metaphysics can only make serious advances if it's practiced in, I quote, a scientific spirit. Beyond an unrelenting commitment to, again Williamson, a combination of logical mathematical reasoning with elementary modal knowledge in particular cases, Williamson claims, in some looser ways, to follow a methodology, again Williamson, akin to that of a natural science. Both are abductive. Very general theories are judged partly on their strength, simplicity, and elegance, partly on the fit between their consequences and what is independently known. End of quote. He takes his modal logic as metaphysics to be an exercise in a mature science, namely modal logics, which, again, Williamson, has been in that mature state for more than half a century. End of quote. What is more interesting for the topic of philosophical romanticism than these highly disputable claims is his account of how he believes metaphysics as modal logic has gotten where he takes it to be right now. Another quote from Williamson. Sciences typically begin in confusion. At first, there are no established standards. All claims to expertise are contested by rivals. The most elementary principles of one theory are contradicted by those of another. Nevertheless, gradually some order emerges. In a mature science, despite a few troublemaking dissenters, there are established standards, acknowledged experts, and accepted elementary principles. End of quote. As is well known among the present audience, Kant as well as post-Kantian philosophy depart from the impression that metaphysics is precisely not such a mature science. Nay, not even a science at all. Surely the meaning of science has changed since then, but the epistemological worries associated with any claim to accepted scientific standards in metaphysics have not gone away, as Williamson suggests. So I'm one of those, of the few troublemaking dissenters here. In my view, the philosophical point of the departure of philosophical romanticism is the acknowledgement of the fact that every theory-building process has to result in articulated text produced in light of the ideal to make a thought intelligible to oneself and to others. Yet acknowledging the inevitability of the written articulation of a thought ought to commit one to recognizing that no understanding of any utterance is forced to ascribe it exactly one given meaning. Against this background, early philosophical romanticism in the work of Friedrich Schlegel and Schelling argues that it's impossible to live up to any ideal of clarity that presupposes that we can even in principle achieve an all-encompassing complete theory of absolutely everything. According to them, it's simply impossible to make everything explicit. As Schlegel puts it in his Jena Transcendental Philosophy from 1800-1801, my translation, according to our view, absolute understanding, absolutes Verstehen, is not at all possible. This derives from dogmatism. If there were an absolute truth, there would also be an absolute intelligibility. Intelligibility contains two things. One, the defective concept of absolute intelligibility. Two, the requirement directed at the one who communicates that he ought to do this in a certain way, which lies in the concept of intelligibility, end of quote. Now, there are, of course, very different manners of dealing with the worry that there might be limits of clarity and understanding. One way of pinning down the meaning of philosophical romanticism would be to present it as the claim or set of claims premised on the view that there is an indissoluble background of potentially infinite maneuvers in conceptual space on which we draw when making sense of things in the broadest possible sense, to borrow Sellers's formulation. Against this background, I approached the project of early Friedrich Schlegel and of Schelling throughout his entire career as accounts of metaphysical theory building that live up to the hermeneutic insight that philosophy is tied to specific, highly individual and variable conditions of understanding. The question then becomes how we can engage in metaphysical theory building without either turning into dogmatists or skeptics, where dogmatism, for Schlegel and Schelling, is a form of metaphysical realism that not only assumes that reality as a whole is a necessarily fixed and always already completely ontologically individuated, mind-independent Über-object, a totality of facts necessarily obtaining, regardless of any concept formation on our side. Even though skepticism for Schlegel is explicitly part and parcel of philosophical theory building, he does not thereby himself become a skeptic in the sense of someone who actually endorses the ideal of absolute intelligibility and is then frustrated by constantly falling short of it. Schlegel and Schelling draw the conclusion that metaphysical realism in the sense envisaged by dogmatism is incompatible with the very freedom manifest in theory building itself. If the claims of dogmatism were indeed true, they could in principle not be verified in the hermeneutically open context of theory building from the standpoint of a human being, as such a context would turn out to be a mere illusion. In light of this, today I will take a closer look at Schlegel's and Schelling's way of dealing with hermeneutic freedom. As has not been sufficiently brought out, Schlegel's essay on incomprehensibility über Unverständlichkeit is an important backbone of Schelling's so-called freedom essay. As you will see, if I have time, a crucial passage from the later actually quotes the earlier without explicit reference. We would call this plagiarism. It's a nice and long quote, by the way, in Schelling's freedom essay. In what follows accordingly, I will first reconstruct the train of thought underpinning Schlegel's claim that unintelligibility and misunderstanding are inevitable in the search for truth and consequently in any theory-building process. I will then, and I will probably not make it today, irresponsibly briefly sketch Schelling's way, so irresponsibly briefly means not at all, Schelling's way of dealing with this in his ontology. Fortunately, having said what I just said can itself be interpreted as a romantic gesture, the presentation of a fragment of a paper, which is work in progress, so I can leave out the really hard part today, in which I would have tried to make sense of the concept of matter in Schlegel and Schelling. I leave that for the publication. So part one, Schlegel on unintelligibility. The central question Schlegel addresses in his essay is whether the communication of ideas, Mitteilung von Ideen, is even so much as possible, ob sie überhaupt möglich sei. This whether possible question has an unmistakable Kantian ring to it, which is important to bear in mind right away. Of course, Kant asks how possible, wie möglich, wie sind synthetische Urteile a priori überhaupt möglich, and not a whether possible. So this is a whether possible question. This, of course, slightly changes the game already. For Schlegel, at the outset of this text, does not reflect on communication or the possibility of meaning in general, but rather on the communicability, Mitteilbarkeit of ideas. Here, an idea refers to a conception of reality as a whole, as an object of theory building. In Transcendental Philosophy, Schlegel writes, an idea is a knowledge of the whole. Eine Idee ist ein Wissen des Ganzen, where I understand a knowledge of the whole to mean an attempt to refer to the whole. This conception of an idea also transpires from the first paragraph of the essay on unintelligibility, which contains an entire meta-metaphysics, to use the contemporary jargon. So here's a longer quote, which I will then try to make sense of. Some objects of human contemplation, einige Gegenstände des menschlichen Nachdenkens, because of what lies in them or in us, entice us to an ever deeper contemplation, and the more we follow this enticement and lose ourselves in them, the more they all are united into a single object, which, depending on whether we seek it and find it inside or outside of ourselves, we characterize as the nature of things or as the destiny of human beings. If we, in monastic seclusion, devoted our contemplation singly and exclusively to this object of all objects, others would perhaps never be able to attract our attention. Nor would they if we were not engaged in social interaction. Through reciprocal communication, social interaction engenders relations and concepts of relations that themselves become objects of contemplation. These, on closer reflection, in turn reproduce and entangle themselves, thus leading us away from this one object. End of quote. A lot is going on in this passage. I want to focus on the remarkable transition in the text from some objects of thought, einige Gegenstände des Nachdenkens, to a single object, ein Gegenstand, and then to the object of all objects, Gegenstand aller Gegenstände. Schlegel starts with some, moves to one, and then eventually goes to all objects. He does not tell us what exactly the objects are he might have in mind as instances of this general train of thought. In my view, he follows Kant's diagnosis from the Transcendental Dialectics in the first critique, according to which it's a natural illusion to confuse the distributive unity of all objects, an omnitudo realitatis, with an object of which all other objects are proper parts, in such a way that it serves as their principle of unity. I read this as an investigation into some of the conditions of metaphysical inquiry. Metaphysical inquiry is characterized by the desire to give an account of absolutely everything, that is, on one prominent construal, an account of all objects insofar as they are objects, that is, reference of proper names, which we can individuate in truth at thought by ascribing properties to them. Metaphysics, in one word, is a theory of totality. Since Plato and Aristotle, it's clear that this does not necessarily consist in pointing out a specific type of object, say water, to which all other objects actually reduce. Plato and Aristotle proposed that metaphysics is capable of knowing everything, panta epistastai, by knowing the principles of everything. Yet the question raised by Kant and his successors is precisely under which conditions the required act of abstraction from given objects of everyday knowledge could be achieved. How do we even get into the position of specifying categorical identity criteria that individuate objects in general, regardless of their individuating features that discriminate them from objects in the context in which we happen to pick them up? In a seminal book on Schelling, Wolfram Hogrebe has termed this approach metaphysics as fundamental heuristics. Schlegel distinguishes between two possible overall results of metaphysical theory building. One result is what he calls a theory of the nature of things, Natur der Dinge. The other is a theory of the determination of man, Bestimmung des Menschen. He informs us that looking for the one paradigmatic object out there leads to the first form of metaphysics, while searching within us leads to the second. Thus, the overall outlook of a metaphysical theory is premised on the heuristic setup of how and where we search and find, suchen und finden. Otherwise put, metaphysical theory building departs from a given conception of objects from einige Gegenstände des menschlichen Nachdenkens. Call this the departure domain of objects. The departure domain is originally restricted. It does not contain all objects, but always only some objects on the basis of which we hope to successfully generalize. Schlegel adds that the objects encountered in the departure domain entice us, reizen, such that we eventually lose ourselves in the contemplation of these objects, uns in sie verlieren, which results in the effect that the specific given objects from the departure domain all turn into one object, werden sie alle zu einem Gegenstand. In one word, We depart from some more or less specific set of objects, and we wind up with the idea that they represent a paradigmatic object. This corresponds to a common trait of the notion of an idea in both Plato and Kant. An idea is a paradigmatic object whose characteristics we can articulate with predicates, which then can truly be said of given objects in a departure domain. Notice, Schlegel does not praise this activity. Rather, he claims that it has a blind spot. He diagnoses a tendency to retreat into the contemplation of the departure domain in light of its constitutive idea such that it results in, as he puts it, an exclusive and one-sided contemplation. The blind spot of this procedure for him lies in ignoring the fact that our contact and exchange with other thinkers is a condition on the establishing of the relation and concepts of relation, making metaphysical inquiry possible. Losing oneself in the contemplation of a departure domain of metaphysical inquiry amounts to the belief that the departure domain has a logical structure that is utterly and in any relevant respect independent from our exchange of thoughts about the domain. Yet, Schlegel points out that we first and foremost need to project truth conditions onto the departure domain in order to be in a position to figure out the facts about the domain. But that presupposes the availability of a shared language. The question thus becomes how we can guarantee that any language we employ when attempting to define truth conditions for our metaphysical assertions about the departure domain is sufficiently powerful in order to cover not just some given objects, but ultimately all objects insofar as they are objects. Let us take a look at some more terminology present in the essay. Like many of his contemporaries, Schlegel interprets the Kantian theoretical enterprise as spinning around the concept of the unconditioned, das Unbedingte, in the transcendental dialectics of the first critique. The key distinction in their eyes is that between the unconditioned and the conditioned, a conceptual distinction which, according to Novalis, Schlegel, or Schelling, to just name a few, results in an irresoluble conflict between the two, unauflöslicher Widerstreit, as Schlegel puts it. Given the opening of the essay and my suggested meta-metaphysical interpretation, here's a possible way of making sense of the claim that there is an insoluble antinomy located in human knowledge striving for a theory of totality. As pointed out, any theory-building enterprise designed in order to establish metaphysics as a systematic science will have a point of departure, so probably no one disagrees with that. As Schlegel writes in his Transcendental Philosophy, that's of course the opening line, we philosophize, this is a fact, hence we begin with something. Wir philosophieren, dies ist ein Faktum, wir fangen also an, wir beginnen mit etwas, end of quote. Well, Hegel disagrees, we shouldn't begin with etwas, but that's probably just a wordplay. Okay. In On Incomprehensibility, Schlegel associates the point of departure, wir beginnen, with a departure domain of objects, einige Gegenstände des Nachdenkens. The point of departure, however, necessarily is limited in that it cannot yet cover the theory being built, that is, the goal of the activity. For this reason, there is a tendency to lose oneself in the departure domain, which means to cancel out the theoretical decisions that constitute the departure domain as a candidate sample of objects on the basis of which we could possibly generalize so as to eventually achieve a metaphysical overview over all objects insofar as they are objects. How can we ever hope to guarantee that the departure domain indeed contains the sort of object that would paradigmatically represent the furniture of reality if the very fact that we depart from this rather than some other unobserved domain hinges on a decision that does not itself count as one of the objects currently under investigation? In paragraph 6 of Word and Object, Quine draws a picture very similar to the one I'm ascribing to Schlegel. He would love me for that. Fortunately, he's dead. So I'm quoting Quine. Everything to which we concede existence is a posit from the standpoint of a description of the theory-building process, and simultaneously real from the standpoint of the theory that is being built, end of quote. The upshot of this famous train of thought is that there is no theory that sufficiently covers both standpoints such that it contains all true propositions about the departure domain and about the theory-building process itself. To illustrate this with another metaphor, to map the world in this way is to exclude precisely that part of the world in which this very mapping takes place from the world itself. This is why Schlegel, quoting a fragment from the Lyceum, moves from the claim that there is an irresolvable conflict between the unconditioned and the conditioned, between the theory building and the domain of objects under investigation, to the position that this amounts to the impossibility and necessity of a complete communication. That's Schlegel. Unmöglichkeit und Notwendigkeit einer vollständigen Mitteilung. This obvious contradiction yields, as he puts it, the freest of all licenses. That's him, not just by the logical explosion of an ex falso quod libet. I mean, of course, if I say the impossibility and necessity of X, then of course this is the freest of all licenses because it's a contradiction. But I think he has more to say. For the point is to continue a conversation with other possible points of departure for metaphysical theories in order to achieve an insight into the decisions one has undertaken when constructing a given metaphysical system. This standpoint, from which one can hope to achieve a Socratic form of self-understanding, qua theory-building agent, culminates in what he calls the irony of irony, die Ironie der Ironie. In my reconstruction, this second-order irony hints at, as he puts it in Winken, the view that every metaphysical system is really a combination of two levels. Level 1, the object level on which it locates an alleged extant totality of objects, paradigmatically represented by some kind of absolute object of all objects. And level 2, the level of second-order commitments constituting a decision to treat some kind of object as paradigmatic or fundamental from the future standpoint of the envisaged theory of totality. The second level can never be reconciled with the first in such a way that we achieve both a metaphysical system and an equally complete and justified account of the decisions that constitute the framework within which true statements about objects can be made. At this point, Schlegel needs to make sure that this sketch for a theory of metaphysical theory building does not itself collapse into a metaphysical system. Yet given the view that every theory building process has some higher order blind spot that is not transparent to itself on the level of its departure domain, how could he actually make sense of the fact that his meta-metaphysical theory is subject to the insight into incompleteness? Instead of giving up on his construction due to the inherent paradox of irony, Schlegel argues that the unrecoverable blind spot of any metaphysical theory building process is actually a condition for there to be the drive to build metaphysical theories. Unintelligibility on some level is not only inevitable, but also required, and that it's a condition for there being stable rational structure as well as the need for communication. So here's one of these typically high-flown expressions of this point. I quote, "But is incomprehensibility actually something so completely reprehensible, so base? I think that the welfare of families and of nations rest on it. If I'm not utterly deceived, states and systems, the most artificial works of humankind, are often so artificial that one cannot admire the wisdom of their creator enough. An unbelievably small portion of incomprehensibility is adequate if it's only kept completely true and pure, and no heinous understanding dares to approach its holy confines," etc., etc., etc. End of quote. Schlegel here presents a picture according to which metaphysics wants to make the entire world intelligible, as he puts it, and he tells his reader that this ideal founders on one of its conditions, namely on the contrast between understanding and unintelligibility. We only understand anything whatsoever by distributing a system of names, predicates, rules of inference over a domain. We need to construct such a system and cannot simply find it out there by opening our eyes, which is why we are fallible even as metaphysical theory agents. It's thus only ever possible to build a metaphysical theory if we accept certain posits as a starting point so as to find ourselves confronted with a departure domain of objects. Yet this presupposes that there is, as Schlegel puts it, that there is a point which has to be left in the dark. A point nevertheless carrying and upholding the whole, dafür aber auch das Ganze trägt und hält. I would even venture to claim that there is a corresponding reading of the poem with which the essay ends, the first stanza of which is an intertextual cross-reference to Goethe's poem Beherzigung, first published in 1789. So here's the first stanza of the poem. "The same thing won't do for all. Let each man look to what he does. Let each man look to where he stands, and whoever stands, that he not fall. Eines schickt sich nicht für alle. Sehe jeder, wie er es treibe. Sehe jeder, wo er bleibe, und wer steht, dass er nicht falle." End of quote. In the context of my suggested meta-metaphysical reading of the essay, the stanza might be seen as endorsing the view that the point to be left in the dark is not an overall common point, a point of departure for all metaphysical theory building. The point to be left in the dark is precisely not the absolute, if by the absolute we mean some kind of fixed Überobject, substance or totality. The point to be left in the dark is rather highly individualized, as it depends on a given departure domain and only exists as the blind spot constitutive of a given theory-building process. In Transcendental Philosophy, Schlegel explicitly endorses the basic idea of Schleiermacher's discourses on religion, he quotes it, in particular the view that our access to ideas is irremediably and entirely individual, ganz individuell. This is why there can be no all-encompassing system, but rather a chaos of systems, ein Chaos von Systemen, as he puts it again in his Transcendental Philosophy. I will end here and just flag that he defines matter as a chaos, and by chaos he means a not yet systematized, merely extensional set of elements. This is my understanding of matter here. So if you don't yet have an intention to pick out objects in a domain, then you're confronted with matter. But given that you cannot say anything, that you cannot ascribe truth properties to statements that would possibly refer to entities in the set, you cannot speak about it. So I will leave it at that in order to have discussion with some of the Schlegel specialists in the room. Such as Dalia Nassar.
Thank you, Markus. I think what you're getting at is really interesting, and I'm generally sympathetic, but I have a question about, well, I guess I have an alternative answer to the question that you pose, and I think it's the right question. How do you deal with hermeneutic freedom? I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. And I guess my answer, following in the same kind of line of thinking where you're coming from, would be, what Schlegel does is look at the history of philosophy and say, well, these are all the different positions that have developed, right? So this is the hermeneutic freedom. And therefore, there's something concrete and something grounded rather than chaos, as you put it. And so the chaos is not really chaos. It's actually a historical account of hermeneutic freedom. And this gives us a sense of where we can go and what we can know and the different positions. And so it gives us a sense of a totality, even though it's not a metaphysical totality, it's a historical hermeneutic totality. But so I think that's how I interpret Schlegel's response to the hermeneutic freedom question. So I'm curious how you would respond to that.
I think I would add that on his account of understanding, so on his hermeneutics, okay, this totality is not itself fixed. So I don't think that he believes that there are those philosophical positions out there which are in contradiction with each other, you know, from Plato to Kant and Spinoza and whoever else is in the picture, Fichte and so forth, whoever he took a look at. And then that would be the chaos or a totality, because for him it all hinges on how you interpret them. So there's this further additional hermeneutic insight that you cannot believe that there's an author out there called Plato or Fichte and that they have contributed to the system, to the totality of possible philosophical systems in the following way. This is what I called the translation problem. I think that he has a he's a pragmatist about linguistic meaning, I think. So the meaning of no utterance is fixed utterly independent. I say utterly independent in order not to make him look like a skeptic. So the meaning of linguistic meaning is not fixed utterly independent of social interaction. Okay, which if you put it this way, it's not a crazy view according to which there is no linguistic meaning but only social interaction. Yeah.
How would you then interpret this, the Vorlesungen, the Jena Vorlesung, where he really is giving you a sense, this is what Fichte says, this is what Spinoza says, and this is what I'm going to say, and it's going to take both into account, and it's all historical, therefore it's not a fixed, but it's still, he thinks that he's figured out what they're saying.
I'm not, well, I mean, everybody thinks this all the time, but I think that that's crucial, you know, that's what reading is, but I think that, that he wants to keep it open. Yeah, look at the readings. I mean, the readings that he presents, I guess, in the eyes of most of the people present there, I mean, we know about some people who were there, would be crazy readings. Just imagine you present Kant with the Schlegel reading of what he's doing. It's not like everybody knows that this is Kant or Plato. So the readings themselves are, to say the least, provocative. And I think this is intended. So I think that he's trying to bring out something in those texts that, that people usually do not see. The blind spot. You know, he is just Heidegger without National Socialism on that level. So there's something unsaid in those texts, and I need to make this explicit without thereby committing to the ideal of absolute clarity. This is how I see, his hermeneutics, his approach to the history of philosophy.
Thanks for a very stimulating talk. I'm trying to sort of situate the reading you're giving of what he's getting at in unintelligibility in relation to a few other ideas that seem to be floating around in that period and in that piece. And so I just want to mention the three of them and ask you to sort of situate your focus in relation to them, and maybe there will be, discrepancies. Maybe some of them will overlap. I don't know. So, three things that this idea of the limits of interpretation seem to mean at different points around this period in Schlegel would be the following: the idea that all classical texts are endlessly interpretable.
Yeah.
You never are going to exhaust the interpretation of a classical text, where that doesn't seem to mean what it would mean for a Gadamer or a Derrida. There is no fixed meaning, and meaning is, as it were, constituted in relation to an endlessly varying community of recipients. That's not the idea. It's just that there are meanings there, but they're sort of endless, they're bottomless. So there's that idea. And then there's the idea of the chaos of interpretation rising from the chaos of reality. And this goes back to a point a question I would have asked of Andreas in his talk, namely, to what extent Schlegel at this period is committed not just to the productiveness of contradictoriness and confusion, but to its ineliminability, as it were. It's not just that, as with any reading of the Hegelian dialectic, it turns out that contradictions are very important because they lead us forward to a better view and so on. It's that in the end, contradictions are in some sense the bottom line. That's how the world is. It's chaotic, confused, contradictory. And a very good essay by Patch has sort of traced this idea of the chaotic nature of any deep text back to this ontological claim about the chaotic nature of reality. So that's the second. And then the third is the one you were alluding to at the end, coming out of Schleiermacher, the idea that the limits of interpretation arise from the fact that we're so irreducibly and thoroughly individual ultimately, even in our conceptualization, that we can only ever approximate the understanding of another person. So those are sort of three ideas that are floating around this period. I wondered if you could relate your interpretation to those.
My text even had a motto. Here's the motto. It's a quote from the essay. A classical text must never be able to be understood completely. Eine klassische Schrift muss nie ganz verstanden werden können. Obviously, Gadamer loved this quote. And so of course, so there's that. And I think this, this harks back to my response to Dalia. So he can't believe to have understood any text completely, at least, which doesn't mean not to have understood it at all, but not completely. So, but I would disagree with your reading of what Gadamer and Derrida are up to. I think they're not doing anything different from that. So I don't see a difference, a real difference there. But okay, so there are limits of interpretation, and I do think that he argues for this claim that there are limits of interpretation indeed on the basis of what I call meta-metaphysics. So I think this is where the action takes place. So his question is, how can we, I think that's his overall question. So how is it possible for us to understand a given domain of objects? So what is it for us to impose criteria of intelligibility, identity criteria, predicates, and so forth, over a given domain? So the Kantian question, what's the relation between the conceptual sphere and the given? So he translates this into this very general idea of system building. So how is this possible in general, regardless from specific issues of sensibility and so forth? So he generalizes the Kantian question in my view, which is why he can then apply to hermeneutics, to political philosophy, and everywhere. So I think this is where he's moving. That's the movement of abstraction, and then and this grounds his specific commitments in the context of limits of interpretation. This leads me to your third question. The individual, I think he does not believe that limits of interpretation are a side effect of an absolute that withdraws. That's not the picture. One picture would be, well, there really is an entity such that the very presence of that entity in the world or in the overall totality generates the problems, the absolute. How can we ever get there? It's relationless, and that would be one way of. And I think what he is saying is that this is already misguided. What we should really think, like famously, truth is relative, blah blah blah. Those I'm thinking of those propositions in transcendental philosophy. I think what he's saying is that the limits of interpretation are relative to a given set of parameters, so to given posits. So relative to that person's posit, that is unintelligible. Relative to that person's posit, that other thing is intelligible. But that does not mean that there is exactly one domain of unintelligible entities. I think he's rejecting that view. So this is how I understand his account of individuality as a meta-metaphysical account.
So it may just be a fourth thing, actually.
Yeah, this would be a fourth. This would be a fourth thing.
Thanks for your talk. You mentioned that Schelling in the Freiheitsschrift quotes Schelling without attribution, Schlegel without attribution, and I'm just wondering if you know of any textual evidence or other historical evidence that Schlegel's essay, or the essays that you draw on, might have been inspired by Schelling's philosophical letters. And I'm thinking there, I mean, there's a real similarity with Schelling's argument that it's exactly what he calls the practical decision to abstract from the sort of distributive unity of objects to the object of all objects, or the principle of their unity, that this decision is itself the reason why any such decision would be one-sided. And this is Schelling's argument against Fichte and Spinoza, or a Fichtean and a Spinozist. I'm just wondering if you know of any textual evidence that Schlegel would have been drawing on Schelling's earlier text.
Well, he doesn't mention him in this period, but of course they were talking to each other. So it's very likely, first, that he's read the text, and second, that he's somehow influenced by Schelling. But they were competitors on many different levels, the entire family. So there's this.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
But yeah, certainly. I mean, you find this idea. Schlegel and Schelling are very close to each other. When it comes to this account of metaphysical theory building, I think that the freedom essay is basically nothing but an elaboration of the basic ideas of Schlegel. So I don't think that that you find anything new in the freedom essay. And Schelling has a hunch that this is the case. And there's this one footnote that I would have quoted towards the end of the text, where he actually refers to Friedrich Schlegel, dismisses him on very general grounds. Artistic, aesthetic, I'm a philosopher, this is just aesthetics, that kind of story. But then he commits precisely to the basic propositions of both transcendental philosophy and on unintelligibility. So I think that they are much closer than either one of them would have liked. So this is I don't know where the exact lines of influence are.
Hi, I'm Michel Shaouli from Indiana University. Thank you for this talk. I'm not sure I understood everything. It was very fast, or another way of putting it is I was much slower than your talk. So this may be inappropriate. I was interested in your reconstruction of the essay and struck by how neatly it fit into propositional language.
Yeah.
When I think of the essay, the overriding mood of it is irony, and it is not a localized phenomenon. It's not one point that might be mobile, but it's pervasive. And so I wonder whether for that reason, this essay lends itself to as being a basis for a propositional system of, as you put it, theory building, or whether it's the kind of thing where the essay always wins because it is always, in a sense, a step ahead of you. So just kind of a question about whether that's a good place to build to build a structure like the one you'd like to build?
Well, I think, whatever cannot be translated into a series of arguments is just meaningless. So I don't think then there's a remaining mystery. So either Schlegel has something to say, or I don't care about him. So this is my own hermeneutics when it comes to these texts. So this is for me a premise. What's going on here? So he has to earn these claims. So if he doesn't earn his claims, he makes a lot of big claims. This text is really a mouthful, but it's a great text in my view. But he has to earn the claims. And I think when looking at how he earns the claims, he has a lot to say. So I don't think that Schlegel himself believed to be beyond philosophical argumentation in that sense at all. He just thinks that specific strategies of writing and irony and so forth get him or make the reader aware of a blind spot in the system of the reader when approaching the text, and it keeps him from not becoming a dogmatist before the end of the day. This is how I would look at it. So I don't think that there's an inherent, almost transcendent feature of this enterprise such that it always withdraws, and this is not how I would like to read it. It might be the case that like I'm not denying that this way of looking at this text is not itself driven by an ideal of clarity, which I would happily make explicit. So it's one interpretation of this text.
Well, one other possibility would be, other than a transcendent point which escapes, is that that this is about language, right? So the essay is a lot about language, obviously. And so there could be a way in which one thinks of the material performance of the language itself as being implicated in this irony, rather than on some transcendent or propositional level. So that would be another option to think about it.
Yeah, but then, what, I mean, that's a very general question. What do you do with a given philosophical text from the tradition? What does it mean to read it? Either we can just read it out loud, that would be reading, but, or we try to understand it. What does it mean to try to understand it? Well, we have to translate it, which is why I started with the translation problem. And when we translate it, we of course assume that we had the right meaning, that we got the right meaning, we got it roughly right, and now we will start disagreeing about the details. That's the assumption, and I think that Schlegel is operating on, explicitly on the basis of a recognition of that point. And that is very different indeed from many other typical texts in, say, contemporary philosophy, where people just think they're making a point and using language while making the point. So they think that the language they're using is like the English subtitles to a Chinese movie. So the movie is running and they're just writing this, and that would be incompatible with this approach.
Yeah, the main problem of Schlegel's interpretation, I think, is to give the coherent picture, coherent concept of his philosophy thinking. I tried first with my first book, Verstehen und nicht verstehen by Friedrich Schlegel. I published it 25 years ago by Roman Holzbook. Just tried to explore that Schlegel's philosophy is some form of communication between understanding and not understanding, verstehen und nicht verstehen. It's a really communicative problem in exploring of all what you try to explore. And he makes first distinction in German philosophical tradition between understanding and comprehension, verstehen und begreifen. Begreifen is always one to have in grief, so really hard without this bright aspect of exploring. And the second point is very important for his for understanding of his philosophy, is this criticism or critic on abstract objectivity, Kritik der Verdinglichung. Just in the Köln lecture, he tried to explore that main problem of continental philosophy. Greek philosophy is just this onta are always abstract, fictes Ich is abstract. He says very nice, das fictes Ich dialektisiert only mit sich selbst. Also it's close in himself. And just to break this solipsistic concept on one side of a subject, philosophy of subject, and the other side empty form of onta, which he explored at Sitting and Verdingung, and just how to find some form of poetical reflection to overcome that's main problem in his philosophy.
Well, if I understand you correctly, so roughly the picture that I was presenting, so here's a very condensed form of the argument that I'm, set of arguments really, but you know, the argument scheme of what I'm ascribing to Schlegel in this text and in Transcendental Philosophy, I limited myself to those two texts really, you know, like there's other stuff going on in other writings even of the time, but looking at those texts, and it might already be a contentious claim to read those together, okay, but I'm doing that. And then I think the picture is something like that. So one way of looking at what we're doing when practicing philosophy, I'm talking here about theoretical, but generally all philosophy probably works like that, is one way of looking at it would be to say there's a conceptual space out there and we are mapping it with philosophical analysis. Okay. Now, Schlegel's objecting to that view that on this level of theorizing, we cannot assume that there is such a conceptual space out there, because if there were such a conceptual space out there, this would raise the problem that we cannot guarantee to have access to that space. So we need an account that is compatible with the social constitution of linguistic meaning. I think that's what he's after. Okay, so what many contemporary philosophers would call pragmatism. This is at least Brandon's understanding, I take it, of pragmatism. So he's rejecting metaphysical realism on that level and replacing metaphysical realism with what he's up to. I think this is my claim, that this is going on there. And this in part explains why he believes that it's necessary to look for different ways, different forms of expression. I mean, that seems to be a commonplace of the time, right? Don't do it like Spinoza. Spinoza thinks there's a conceptual space out there, and you just need mathematics to track it. That's dogmatism. But we are, of course, beyond that, because we have assimilated, if you like, you know, the Schlegel's point.
Yeah, on the other hand, you have this ironic point of view, what you quoted just, Notwendigkeit und Unmöglichkeit der Mitteilung. Yeah. This is just a point of necessity of thinking, to try to get this, what you have to explore.
So thank you. I just wanted to say something about the kind of way of the philosophers you mentioned at the beginning, in particular someone like Williamson could say about that, try to pointing out that his own business is not really affected by this kind of Schlegelian argument. I'm myself sympathetic with that, but it's just advocatus diaboli. So I think if I got it right, the problem is, okay, we always start with a departure domain of objects, and then we come to a certain generalization. But they could say, and so it all depends on which domain we choose. This, they could argue, is something more relevant, let's say, for empirical theory building. For instance, I see, I don't know, 10 crows, they are all black, and I conclude all crows are black. It's like the induction problem. So there you always start really with a domain of object, and then you have the problem of the generalization. But someone like Williamson could say, well, I'm just doing logic. I'm not concerned with objects at all. I'm just, you know, sitting in my armchair and I...
Yeah, he doesn't do that. Huh? Williamson explicitly says in a paper like Absolutely Everything, for instance, that metaphysics is not, in that sense, a priori. Metaphysics deals with all objects, insofar as they are objects. So Williamson would reject that premise. Well, he would, he wouldn't say, like, that's not the way he would defend himself, I think, that line.
Okay, Kant says also something like that, but he doesn't need a particular domain of object to start with. He could say, I'm just concerned with objecthood in general, so I don't need to start with, you know, 10 crows. And,
but the question is, how do you arrive there? And so there are arguments, very good arguments, against the very idea. You don't start with objecthood as such. It's not like, you know, oh, there are all the objects. I don't care about them. Let's care about objecthood. But let's do it in terms of the translation problem, which I really, I had some of his stuff in mind when I introduced the translation problem. So let's say you're practicing modal logic as metaphysics. That's the book title. So I was quoting from the famous or infamous afterword, Must Do Better, in which he says, now philosophy has begun with that book and mature science and so forth. And so there are certain things that we say, it's necessary that 2 + 2 = 4. It's, physical necessity is such that, if you know everything about the given state of the universe at t and have the blah, 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 then you know everything about it. So maybe there's physical necessity. So you start with all sorts of examples of necessity in ordinary language and science. And now you say, well, let's say necessity is box. And then you write box P. So now you have made first of all, you have made all sorts of assumptions, okay? And now you're talking about necessity meaning something very specific, and you have to claim that you have understood the sentences in the departure domain. That's the case there. So you have to say, well, it's necessary that 2 + 2 = 4 means, say, it's true in all possible worlds. So you're giving an account of something that you claim to have understood. That would be the departure domain in that case. So I don't think that anybody would deny that there is a departure domain. But the question is if you accept the Quinean view that if there is such a departure domain, then there's already a conceptual structure of posits that allows you to have the departure domain in view in the first place. And if you move from the departure domain, if you generalize on that basis, by making explicit the conceptual framework, that framework will be local. So you think it's not local, but it will always be local. And I think there are very good arguments to that effect, and that Williamson has not confronted them at all, at least not in that book. In some other papers he's trying to do that. So I think these arguments are still arguments of this form, conceptual relativity, ontological relativity, and so forth, are still very, very powerful, and I don't see counter-arguments against them in Williamson, beyond the claim that formally you can establish an unrestricted universal quantifier. So I hope I was responding in a fair way, because you're making a very good point.